All right, thank you very much for being here. Raphaël Zagourian is professor of philosophy at the Institut Catholique de Paris. I myself am a professor at the University College Dublin. What we'll be presenting today is a reflection, an ongoing reflection that we've been having on the question of history. I think you will see by the elements that we've put on the whiteboard, catastrophe, nihilism, technology, through the words of crisis and apocalypse. What we're going to try and do for you in the very short time that we do have is to develop another modality of subjectivity, another modality of historical consciousness in the long string of the philosophies of history from Kant, Hegel, and in a certain manner Heidegger. So I'll just leave it over to Raphael to begin us off into this examination, and we'll see how far we get.
Okay, so this reflection, this ongoing reflection, as Joseph said, will revolve around that which returns in history, and that which arrives in history. Ce qui revient et ce qui arrive. Historical event. An historical event is always that which returns to our history and that which arrives constantly in our history. So following this approach to history and historical events, the traditional dichotomies, the conventional dichotomies, or classical concepts of the philosophies of history, that is, contingency and necessity, for example, or particularity and universality, accident and essence, destiny, teleology, reasoning history, eschatology. We will soon be speaking of crisis and apocalypse. All these concepts will appear rather inappropriate. Inappropriate, that is, we will attempt to develop a relation to history capable of engaging with the singularity of events. Singularity in events. That is our main question. Notion of singularity of events. In some way, I can already say that all these common notions, and we will see for crisis and apocalypse, are not exactly appropriate to think the singularity of the event. Singularity of the event. So we will attempt to develop a relation to history capable of engaging with the singularity of events, which is precisely to say those events which return from the past, return to us from the past, and as you know, events keep returning and haunting us, yes, and arrive from the future to incessantly haunt our present. So I don't know if you can maybe tell us the translation of to be haunted in Romanian. Yes. So this is a very important notion for us. Yes. Haunt, to be haunted. We shall seek to deploy the philosophical signification of the idea of the spectre. The spectre. You will see why. The spectre, in order to approach those events which return to our present, as if they arrived from the future, and those events arriving to our present from the future, which remain impossible to simply put to the past. To simply put in the past. In some way, I can also say that the modality of historical thinking through crisis and apocalypse, but we will explain that, are always in some way trying to put the events in the past. So another modality of thinking the historical event would be not to simply put them in the past. In this respect, the traditional dichotomies just mentioned will be seen to emerge from one apparently unquestionable opposition which we are here to deconstruct, namely the opposition between life and death. Life and death. You see, the spectre is that which is not dead and that which is not alive. Simply dead or simply alive. So we are seeking here to deconstruct the opposition between life and death, between the living and the dead. Our attempt, therefore, to develop a novel approach of history, one which tackles the irreducible singularity of historical events, both past and future, as we said. We also entail and engage in a rethinking of the dichotomy between life and death, between what is meant by the living and what is meant by the dead. What is meant by the living, what is meant by the dead, both past and future. Historical events, according to us, relentlessly produce specters, which take hold of our present, and for which the different economies, the different signifiers through which they are rendered graspable, representable, treatable in a general narrative of reason or meaning, and where historical consciousness can furnish the conditions of possibility to come to terms with these very events in history as a whole, will appear inoperative, non-operational. We will demonstrate how and why the present and hence our relation to representation, our relation to our representation of our historical events remain perpetually out of joint, that is to say, haunted by a disarticulation of temporality. So, on the one hand, past historical events, incessantly returning to our present as futural, as if they come from the future, and on the other, future events arriving as irreducible to the treatment of a historical representation capable of inscribing the event itself in our past and comprehending it in general historical narrative. Our question, therefore, can be formulated in the following manner. What occurs to the representation we have of our present when it is assailed indistinctively by that which returns to it from the past and that which arrives to it from an irreducible future? You see, our question is, what occurs to the idea of comprehension, of our capacity to comprehend the events in the historical narrative, and subsequently to our historical subjectivity, as Joseph said, when these are exposed to a type of temporality, whereby both the possibility of commemorative remembrance and that of future anticipation are overflowed by specters. This is our current situation. The scene, I'm sure it is the same in Romania. In France, the public debate today is only about colonialism, mainly about the historical colonialism. So the present, the public political present, is assailed by specters, which constantly return. So, what occurs to these structures, traditional structures of commemorative remembrance and of future anticipation, when they are incessantly overflowed by specters, neither absent nor present specters, and yet also absent and present? neither simply presently living, nor simply absently dead, and yet both living and dead in some way, whose return and arrival to our historical representation dislocates, disrupts, interrupts, interposes, if you wish, the dialectic of recognition, Hegel, and dialectic of reconciliation, Hegelianism, as well as the ontological appropriation of history, Apocalypse, Heidegger. We will explain that. So our question again is, how are we to rethink and to relate to history when historical events, both past and future, in their irreducible, unclassifiable singularity, command a responsibility unassimilable to the recognition, reconciliation, comprehension of time within the speculative dialectic. These questions are eminently political, as they concern the very foundations of democratic rationality in its relation to history, in its relation to memory, and command a renewed manner of approaching the spectralities which, at once and simultaneously, return and arrive to our historical present, and for which the economies of memory, truth, reconciliation are seen to produce against themselves logics of forgetfulness and justification of atrocities in history. So we are trying to avoid these logics of forgetfulness and justification of atrocities in history. That is extremely complicated, since most of our concepts, most of the schemas we have been thinking through in philosophy of history are always in some manner contributing to forgetfulness and to justification of atrocities. Every reflection on our relation to the philosophy of history today, and more generally to history and historical events, cannot avoid engaging with at least the three following phenomena: catastrophe, nihilism, and technology. Firstly, the singularity of catastrophes, both past and future in history, recalls here the various genocidal atrocities and wars in the human history. To name here but a very few number of these amongst all other singular catastrophic events in our history, which had huge impact on philosophy, as you all know. World War I, which produced an, as Walter Benjamin says, impoverishment of experience. According to Benjamin, World War I has produced the impoverishment of experience. The Shoah, or Holocaust, radically and brutally posing in the history of philosophy the question of representability and irrepresentability, of historical singularity, possible impossible testimony, of systematic mass murder, and to use the Lukashian expression, the destruction of reason, of the possible impossible recollection of memory and, by extension, commemoration, possible impossible reparation, mourning, the question of the work of mourning, possibility, impossibility of work of mourning, question of forgiveness in philosophy, the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, which created a new threat for humankind, namely its complete annihilation, closely related to the question of technology and of the future catastrophes dawning on our historical event, the environmental disaster threatening to undermine the grounds of our material existence, as well as the menace of yet a further and inevitably greater nuclear cataclysm, so clearly typified by Günther Anders. I don't know if Anders is known in Romania. So to this list, which is bound to remain endless, of course, we must also add the multiple, diverse, and massive histories of slavery and colonialism in human history, which in turn pose with renewed relevance in the 20th century the philosophical and sociological question of the status of Western rationality in the face of alterity, otherness, difference, and furthermore the question of the manner in which this rationality is politically dealt with alterity, otherness, and difference. The singularity of these events shows, among other things, how past events contain a future in themselves that projects and produces further future singular historical events. Secondly, we must not neglect or minimize the relevance of the nihilism, or the question of nihilism, pervading our present political and societal or even philosophical context. For many, nihilism has become a bygone question, framed in the history of the philosophical tradition and debate. So, Jacobi and the German philosophical tradition, Russian nihilism, the Nietzsche-Heidegger debate on European nihilism. However, according to us, and we have been writing extensively on this question, nihilism today is prevalent, and the exhaustion, l'épuisement, the exhaustion of values and norms, as well as the growing impossibility of fixing or setting renewed values and norms for our political and societal situation, is indicative of a generalizable collapse of the capacity of humankind to reinvent itself. Reinvent itself beyond the repetition of conventional, used up schemas of meaning and signification. Indeed, we have yet posed the question of contemporary nihilism and its diverse and different effects on our political becoming. Have we yet, this is our question, have we yet addressed how and why nihilism has come to pervade the very modalities by which our rationality is treated and dealt with historical events? Have we yet grasped how and why philosophical rationality is productive precisely of nihilism by seeking to overcome nihilism through the establishment of sovereign values and norms based on presumed capacity to collect, to assemble the multiple singularities of existences into a generalizable community of reason or unified horizon of meaning? Although neither the two main references for us here in this talk, which has to end very soon, Derrida and Levinas have never clearly and unambiguously thematized the question of nihilism. It is unquestionable that unquestionably the case in our view that their entire philosophies, and thus their call to responsibility, to another idea of responsibility and to another idea of justice, which is extremely important for Derrida and Levinas, which we refer to here, anterior and antecedent to truth, are precisely addressing the exhaustion of values. Exhaustion of values, norms, typified by contemporary nihilism. However, okay, and thirdly, and I will let you maybe end because maybe we could discuss a little bit, the development of technology actively in framing the possibilities of thinking and thereby reducing these to ordering, norming, corrective and instrumental rationality could engage in what Anders called, provocatively yet at the same time highly significantly, the obsolescence of mankind. We turn to Anders here in this reflection to mark the radical difference between his thinking and Heidegger's ontological analysis of technology. Indeed, for Anders, Günther Anders, the nuclear catastrophe the nuclear catastrophe, and the cataclysm stemming from the all too rapid and uncontrollable development of technology, represents the symbol of the complete self-destruction of human life. Whereas, and this is why we are trying to think beyond apocalypse, for Heidegger, in his famous text on technology, the planetary devastation of technology marks an occasion or even a chance to engage in a turn, la Kehre, in the turn towards the essential Lichtung, the essential clearing of the meaning and the truth of being. Where the former sees the menace of complete destruction of mankind, Günther Anders, by mankind, complete destruction of mankind by mankind, the atomic bomb. The latter, Heidegger, perceives the apocalyptic occasion. As you know, apocalypse means revelation.
Revelation and total destruction.
No, it doesn't mean total destruction. In our common language, it came to mean destruction. It means revelation. This is why, for Heidegger, which is an apocalyptic thinker in the Greek meaning of the word, the apocalyptic, the technological catastrophe is the apocalyptic occasion for yet a further possibility for mankind to re-engage with being itself. With being itself. In this sense, we shall seek to critically question the Heideggerian determination of technology by demonstrating how and why this analysis wholly fails to consider and confront the proliferation of technology. That is, of both its danger and its opportunities, by only engaging in a reactive or reactionary step back into an original truth and historical deployment of the truth of being.
All right, just to conclude very quickly, well, we have a bit of time. It's difficult for me to take over now, but what I think we've seen is the following. Nihilism and technology, as Raphael has just marked, are modalities by which the philosophy of history has comprehended events. The modality by which the comprehension of these events are rendered into a narrative, the history of philosophy, in the philosophy of history, are through crisis and apocalypse. What does crisis mean? Crisis means the very possibility to always, from a critical moment, diagnose and surpass the critical moment. Crisis always involves the surpassing of the critical moment. Can't have a crisis if you don't have a way out of the crisis. This is why, if we return to the etymology of the term crisis, it means the moment of decision. That is, the krinein, the moment of judgment. That is, where the event is analyzed, and from this analysis, surpassed in the reconfiguration of a historical narrative. Apocalypse, on the other hand, is a much more deeper comprehension of a historical event, since it supposes, as Raphael says, a moment, not a critical moment, but a moment of such a break that it opens up to a revelation of the essence or the truth of the historical narrative. An apocalyptic moment, this is why it has come to mean destruction. It is because the historical moment is so radical that it promotes the revelation, not of the historical narrative that can surpass a critical moment, but rather of the essence of history itself. A revelation of the essence or of the truth of the history itself. That's why Raphael was saying that Heidegger's philosophy is structured by this modality of apocalypse, because for Heidegger, the Kehre, the turn, this technological inframing for Heidegger is so radical that it inevitably becomes a turn out of the technological and into the revelation of what he calls the truth of being, the truth of the history of being. What we're seeking, however, to mark is that both these modalities of thinking history are not doing justice to singularity. That's our thesis. Our thesis is that both crisis and apocalypse, as modalities of thinking a historical event, are always in some way relegating that historical event to a type of universality which subsumes the singularity of the event itself. That is, unroots that singularity in order to sow again the universal narrative of history itself. In this sense, what we're seeking is, in order to pay attention to the singularity of historical events, is a deconstruction of both the modalities by which we've traditionally understood historical events, namely crisis and apocalypse. Now, what is singularity? Of course, we could go into a long discussion on both the logical element of singularity. What does singularity mean logically? What does singularity mean metaphysically? And what does singularity mean in and for a philosophy of history? I'm going to jump right ahead into the third of these elements. What does singularity mean for the philosophy of history? Singularity means, and why is it to be dissociated from the traditional critical or apocalyptical manner of looking at historical events? Singular historical events means that historical events always produce specters. What is a specter? What is a specter? A specter is that which is produced by a historical event which arrives to our present as if it never had occurred before. We have to think this. We're going to risk the idea that a historical event is always contains in itself more than its historical manifestation. That is, a historical event is that which produces always other manifestations of itself which impossibilize that a historical event be put to the past. In this sense, to think history radically, we have to think history not as historical, but as constantly and incessantly futural. In other words, here I'm going to be provocative, no historical event has occurred, only all historical events are yet to occur. See what we're trying to do? We're trying to mark the singularity of a historical event as that which is always and incessantly coming to historical subjectivity. Now, if we had time, this would mean a radical deconstruction of the trope of life and death. This would mean a radical rethinking of what it means, life, death. But I'm going to leave you, because I believe, just to leave a little bit of time for questions, I'm going to leave you with that idea that a singular historical event, and ultimately all historical events are to be thought as singular, means that a historical event always produces its futurity as if it never occurred itself. Hence the philosophical question is how to think history, not in relation to the truth of a historical event, but in a relation to justice That is, not in revealing the truth of a given historical event. That would mean I've understood the truth of a historical event, I've included it in a modality of crisis. I've understood the truth of the historical event, I've included it in a modality of apocalypse, and therefore I can think beyond that historical event. Rather, to think not the truth of the historical event, but to think every historical event justly means to think that every historical event is producing a futurity that impossibilizes its being put to the past. In a sense, that's why I was saying, there are no historical, in being provocative, there are no historical events. All historical events are always futural. That is, all singular historical events are always futural. All right, I think I'm gonna close here.
So we can have
we can have a small
10 minutes.
10 minutes
Yes.
of discussion.
The idea of spectrum in history introduces the idea of the circularity of history. Because we live the same. The idea of specters means that we repeat what we lived in the past. And by the way, catastrophes, do not forget, please, Holodomor. Do not forget the destruction of elites in our countries. Holodomor means 6 million people in Ukraine. By the famine, by famine, how do you say?
Famine.
So, please do not forget.
The whole talk is about not forgetting. The whole talk is about not forgetting. So, I mean, all we're trying to do is to resist to the logic of forgetfulness. The logic of forgetfulness is radically inherent to the two main topics of crisis and apocalypse. But because you see, the question that we are posing here is, Walter Benjamin says about the First World War. He wrote on the First World War, right? He says, the biggest catastrophe is that it continues. Meaning that what? We continue to think according to these modalities. And what do we do when we think according to these two modalities? We forget. Meaning, we recognize, we understand, and we permit the continuity of the same schema of historical thinking. So, the whole thing is the whole question here could be maybe reformulated in this manner. Can we still think, or can we continue to think according to the logic of crisis? I mean, is the First World War, is the Holocaust, is the nuclear catastrophe, is yes, are they but simple crises? Is the environmental crisis right now again another crisis? It is not. It is not possible to continue thinking according to critical rationality. Meaning that we have also to reformulate the concept of critique. So this is the whole work of deconstruction. Derrida uses the concept of hypercritical thinking. In a way, Foucault, Deleuze, they all try to rethink critical thinking according to a non-Kantian modality of thinking. So it is definitely not about forgetting. On the contrary, and I will also say, but I will let Joseph maybe answer, that spectrality is not the return of the same. spectre is not, as we try to describe it, it's not the return of the same.
Yeah, that's the point I'd like to pick up on. Spectrality here for us means the return of that which is always singular. It's not the return of the same. The return of that which is
What a
always
paradox.
singular.
What a paradox.
Yes.
What appears, what appears, but that which is always singular as that which is, as what appears, does not have an essence, does not have a ground, does not have a rationality to find its truth, to ground its truth in. In the sense, what we're trying to develop is an idea that a historical event produces returns to our present that are operating as if they were futuro, as if they had never occurred, as if they were not the same. So you see, therefore, an event, a historical event as singular as the famine, for us would mean here that that the famine produces spectralities that are absolutely novel and unedited. Absolutely novel and yet unthought. More radical, yet unthinkable, under the modality of crisis, apocalypse, under the modality by which we even name a historical event.
Maybe just say a word about where do we take this title from? Why do we say history supposes justice?
And you see, to think the singularity of a historical event as that which is constantly and incessantly arriving to the present as if it never occurred, or as if it had not yet occurred, as if it was still occurring singularly in a novel manner to our present, this means that that historical event does not contain a revealable truth, as if I get the truth of the event, I could put it to the past. But it requires an approach of justice, which is dissociated from truth. That's our work. We want to dissociate the idea of justice or of historical justice from the idea of truth, and in a certain manner from the idea of commemoration. Because, not because we have something against commemoration, but because commemoration is not enough.
Because commemoration is a way of forgetting. It's just another way of forgetting.
It's just another way.
It's that simple as that. Let's put the civil war in Spain.
Yeah.
Where's the truth there? And where's the justice there? Because both parts, not just one, are right, is right. Both parts are right or is right.
All right.
Both are right.
Are right. And where's the justice there? Because what we see today is the victory of one part upon the other. But where's the truth and where's the justice? Because both are wrong, both are right.
But you see, when we say history or truth, first of all, it's Lévinas that says in totality and infinity, la vérité suppose la justice. Truth supposes justice. So, we've been trying to understand this proposition by Emmanuel Lévinas. Okay. You see, when we say truth supposes justice or that history supposes justice, we don't know where justice is. We're not saying this is where justice is. You see, justice is that which is.
But we say all the time justice is there.
According to, no, but why do we say all the time justice is there? Because we have been thinking in our philosophical tradition justice as that which is subjected to truth, which is grounded in truth. You see, from the Greeks up to Heidegger, We have all been thinking justice according to the logics of truth, crisis and apocalypse, meaning justice as justification. Justice has been reduced in the history of philosophy to justification. By saying truth supposes justice, Levinas tries to liberate, if you want, justice from the hold of truth. So, what we have been trying to think here is according to an idea of justice which is radically rebellious to the modalities, conventional, traditional modalities of truth in history. Crisis and apocalypse are profound, extremely profound, very serious logics of justification of atrocities in history. Yes.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I would like to ask you, first of all, I would also remember about some traumas we lived here during communism. Okay, and maybe there is a spectrum that comes.
Spectre.
Yes. Some phantoms.
Yes,
some
phantoms. Yes.
I prefer the word phantoms.
Third.
Some phantoms that come from the future.
Yes.
And from the past in the present, because of these abuses we lived here. Okay, so I would like to ask you, what do you think about my idea? Just consider some unconscious rests, some savage, wild rests,
yes.
essences, as _𝐸𝐸 said, that want to be lived. So it's about an irrational justice. Because life is un excès irrationnel.
Un excès irrationnel. Okay.
Because life is excess.
Okay.
Life is more than this homeostasis between living and dying. It's an excess that wants to be lived and that transcends rationality. So maybe it's a justice for the unborn, or for who was born and died and want to come again, yes. And to some rests that need to come and to be lived again for some justice, but it's irrational justice, and also it's unconscious justice. What do you think about that? Because what I can't understand is, yes. Where is the subject? Psychoanalytically, Jacques Lacan, we are divided subjects, we are split subjects. All of us here, because we are not, as you said, whole. We are incomplete. Mm. So where is in all this story of singularity of the historical event, where is the subject, the split subject? Because the subject is singular, is unique.
Yeah, we don't have a lot of time. It's an excellent question. I think it's very, very good to have recalled here _𝐸𝐸, because it's true, l'excès d'irrationalité ou l'excès irrationnel is a trope, I would say, of singularity. There will be lots to say about _𝐸𝐸 here, but I think your question is correct. Where is the subject? And I think the question, the answer, the beginning of an answer to this question is that for us, the subject is and comes not only in being divided, but in a diachronic temporality, mm-hmm. split by a diachronic temporality, that is a temporality that never has a presence or a present, and therefore, excès d'irrationalité, I would say excess of responsibility. There's your subject. Supplement of responsibility, not because it has a ground of presence on which to found its responsible response or its responsibility towards a singular historical event, but precisely because it does not have a ground, it does not have an essence, It is radically split by diachronie itself, by the event itself, which returns as if it never has come, that it awakens a subjectivity of excess of responsibility, of supplementing responsibility.
You see, again, if we take these two examples, and in this paper, which, to be honest, we've presented 4 pages out of 35. So in this paper, we are formulating a sort of deconstruction. Obviously, we don't use the word critique anymore, and you understand why. Of the opposition between the living and the dying. You see, this idea of spectrality is also a way of approaching past events and future events, as Joseph said, outside of the idea that we know that after this event we had such and such number of dead, and we know who is dead, and we know what it is to live. When you think in terms of hauntology, you see, you know the word hauntology, not ontology, hauntology, meaning to be haunted by, and not according to ontos, which is the logic of presence, as you know. You start thinking otherwise the fact that the dead are never totally dead. Yes. And we also have to be responsible of those who are not born yet and will die. So this demands from us a redeployment of the question of subjectivity and historical subjectivity, meaning outside the grounding of the logics of crisis and apocalypse. Because if you look carefully into these two logics, they have been inhabiting most of the philosophies of history. It is only, I would say,
is there a place for a third concept, ascension, or not?
Ascension?
Yes.
Ascension?
Yeah, we would have to see. We'd have to see. What do we mean by ascension? What do we mean by ascension? What do we mean by...
Why are you thinking of ascension in one word?
Because it's like transforming a linear past-future temporality with fatality,
yes.
objective,
yes.
transforming it in a continuous presence.
Continuous presence? Continuous
like
presence.
Because your paradigm, I think it's not objective. It's not about objectivity.
Yeah, that's right. That's very true.
It's a spatial temporality, a
yes.
subjective spatial temporality.
Yeah, it's very true. There is something completely dissociable and dissociated from objectivity. However, the idea of presence or continual presence here, I think, given what we are trying to see in the idea of spectrality, of spectre, and of this diachronic temporality, would make it that a presence, especially a continual presence, would be difficult to think.
It's not this kind.
Yeah.
We ran out of time. We ran out of time. I will take your question immediately. I would just remind you that we have also mobilized the question of nihilism, meaning that something has happened to those notions, which makes us incapable of using them again. We cannot keep using the same notions again. We are facing the question of nihilism. Nihilism is the exhaustion of our usual conventional schemas.